Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, the day has finally come for Lyft as it prepares to set a price for its shares before hitting the public market. We will bring you the latest. Plus, antitrust lights shining on big tech. We speak to the Louisiana Attorney General for his take on what the state should be doing about companies like Google and Facebook. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development versus Facebook. Why Housing Secretary Ben Carson says the social network's ad platform is, quote, just as discriminatory as slamming a door in someone's face. But first, to our top story, Lyft may be the second largest ride-hailing service, but it'll be the first to hit the public market if all goes as planned. The company is preparing to list in less than 24 hours. We break down the company's journey.
2019, the year that so many highly anticipated tech companies plan to go public. Among them, two stand out. A race best described as focus versus frenzy. Frenzy being Uber. Engaging in rapid global expansion and retreat, food delivery, bike sharing, self-driving cars, and flying taxis. Plus a valuation that bankers say could soar to $120 billion. Lyft, on the other hand, may best be described as focus. Launched in 2009, Lyft grew out of co-founders Logan Green and John Zimmer's 2007 startup, Zimride, which connected college students looking for rides, and is focused almost solely on growth in the United States, going from less than a dozen cities in 2009 to 95% of the country in 2019. Lyft now claims it controls 39% of the U.S. ride-hailing market. And it's just starting to go international, launching in Toronto and Ottawa City in 2018. It's keeping up with its top rival by getting in on scooters and bike sharing, buying Motivate that runs City Bike in New York. And yes, it's also working on self-driving cars, buying London-based Blue Vision Labs, beefing up staff working on autonomous technology to over 300 people. Lyft's already courted a slew of major investors like Japan's Rakuten and Andreessen Horowitz. But as it prepares to go public, it's trying to lure more, hoping to impress by doubling its ride count from 500 million in 2017 to 1 billion in less than 1 year. Revenue jumped up 541% to $2.2 billion last year from just $343 million in 2016, with an estimated valuation of $20 to $25 billion. Despite losses increasing 32% to $991 million in 2018. And while Lyft was second out of the gate to launch, it's first in line to go public, weeks or months ahead of Uber. In an increasingly volatile tech market, the hope is investors will hail Lyft's ride.
I want to bring in Bloomberg Tech's Eric Newcomer, who covers Lyft, and our Bloomberg IPO reporter, Olivia Zaleski. So, Olivia, we're waiting for this price any moment now. What are we expecting to happen?
Yeah, any second now. We know that all the bankers and Lyft executives are sitting in a room somewhere deciding the price. You know, they get a lot of orders that come into the book, and then they take a sort of a weighted average of that to determine the price. We should expect it any minute now. You know, originally they came out with a 62 to 68 price range, and then just yesterday they upped that from 70 to 72. But, you know, the murmurs, the energy that we're hearing is that it might even go higher than that.
So, Eric, why such enthusiasm given the revenue and costs issue here, where the company is losing almost half of what it's making?
You know, I think people are betting on a story. It's this sort of endpoint of the on-demand conversation that we've been having for a long time. It's, are people going to sort of switch to taking Lyfts and Ubers more than using their own cars? And so investors are hoping that they're jumping on the next big tech company more clearly than they're doing sort of an analysis of where the money's going to come from, because there isn't a clear sort of accounting of how Lyft will start to throw off cash. You know, it's about betting on this huge trend continuing.
Olivia, at $72 a share at the high end, that would give Lyft a $22 billion or so market cap. Why do investors think that's justified?
Well, if you look at traditional SaaS companies, they usually do about 10x trailing revenue. So Lyft's revenue last year was about $2.2 billion. So it makes perfect sense that they would come out at 22. But I think what Eric just said is right on the money. It's exactly right that they're buying into more than just looking at revenue here. They're buying into this larger story of replacing car ownership. And that's what Lyft has really been pushing as it went out to investors, is are millennials in this next generation even going to own cars?
So, Eric, these are the investors who are enthusiastic. What about the investors who are not so enthusiastic and maybe aren't buying into this? What are they saying?
It will be fascinating what the short position in these companies are. I don't think we've seen that yet, because as private companies, it's difficult, if not impossible, really, to short them. So one thing I'm definitely looking to see is how skeptical people are.
We are getting some initial reporting about the pricing of the shares, but I'm going to wait for a moment before we go with this. Olivia, in terms of what you've heard in the lead up to today, I mean, you've been talking to investors, you've been talking to bankers. What is the sort of prevailing view on how Lyft will set the tone for all of these IPOs to come?
Yeah, I think we cannot put enough emphasis on how important this IPO is for all the other IPOs that we're expecting this year. If it goes horribly wrong, it's really going to put a damper on what we're going to see with Uber, with Slack, with Pinterest, with Postmates even. So I think that all eyes are on Lyft here. It needs to be priced just right. It needs to come out with not too much pop because they leave a lot of money on the table. And then, of course, if the price goes below, that's a terrible sign too. So everybody's watching and wants to know what's going to happen here.
So, Eric, what does this mean for Uber? The fact that there was so much enthusiasm, the fact that, Uber is sort of just beginning this process and has the opportunity to press certain buttons based on what they see happen with Lyft.
I think for now it's great for Uber because the Uber story is going to be, take Lyft, give us some multiplier for the U.S., add up our stakes in Didi, Grab, and Yandex. Think about our international footprint, still in India, now a bigger one in the Middle East with the acquisition of Careem, add on our autonomous program. Uber's is really this cumulative approach. So the valuation of Lyft in the beginning is good. The real question will be how much the two companies are spending against each other and how competition normalizes and how much market share is a focus. Those things, depending on decisions Lyft makes, could hurt Uber, but the big sort of valuation would be great for Uber just because they can say, look, ours has got to be way more than that, so do the math.
So CNBC is actually reporting now that Lyft has priced its shares at the high end of the range at $72 a share, so not going above the boosted range. But Olivia, your reaction to that?
I'm not surprised at all. I mean, actually, I would expect them to go just slightly higher than that based on the conversations that I had with investors today, the enthusiasm for the company. But it makes sense that they want to be conservative here. Again, they don't want to leave money on the table. They don't want to have too much of a pop. So I think that's fair that they come out right at that price.
Eric, your thoughts?
I'm skeptical of this process. I mean, they get to set the initial price expectations and judge them, and they're constantly talking to investors. I think we can't read too much into sort of the pricing games ahead of the IPO. And what's really going to matter is the value Lyft holds over a long time on the public markets as people really figure these companies out. Of course, seeing the numbers go up is good for the company, but I'm not going to read a ton into it.
All right. Well, CNBC again reporting that Lyft pricing its IPO at $72 a share, the high end of the range. Of course, we're going to work on confirming that ourselves. You get on it, Olivia and Eric. Sorry to keep you busy here on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has set its sights on major players in the digital ad space. On Thursday, the agency, led by Secretary Ben Carson, announced it has accused Facebook of violating the Fair Housing Act with ads that can be targeted on the basis of race, religion, or other traits. Later, an HUD spokesperson confirmed that the agency has also reached out to Google and Twitter to get more information on their ad practices. We're going to have more on this story later in the show. Coming up, regulating Google, CEO Sundar Pichai met President Trump this week to discuss the administration's wide-ranging concerns about the search giant. But is it enough to keep individual states happy? We are going to ask the Louisiana State Attorney General, Jeff Landry, coming up next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. On Wednesday, President Trump met with Google CEO Sundar Pichai. According to the president's tweets, they talked about Google's efforts in China and its work with the U.S. military, as well as political fairness, a meeting that the president said ended very well. But despite the positive sentiment, Google and its parent company Alphabet are still being targeted by lawmakers. Senator Elizabeth Warren has called for Google to be broken up. Senator Ted Cruz claims it silences conservative voices. And Bloomberg has previously reported that a group of state attorneys general are laying the groundwork for a probe into Google on the basis of antitrust and privacy concerns. To talk about this, I want to welcome the Attorney General of the state of Louisiana, Jeff Landry. Attorney General Landry, thank you so much for joining us. So
thank you for having me.
Talk to me about, I'm curious what your reaction is to the president's meeting with Google CEO Sundar Pichai, or at least his tweet about it, given that state attorneys general have launched at least a preliminary exploration into whether Google should be probed over antitrust and privacy concerns.
Well, you know, I wasn't privileged to the discussion that the president had, and I would guess that it mainly surrounded Google's activity in China. I don't know, haven't heard that they discussed any of its practices as it relates to data mining, the use of data mining, the manipulation in the digital ad space, and content suppression, all of which you mentioned earlier. So what we have here are different layers of problems all surrounding big tech as a whole. And these are issues that attorney generals around the country on both sides of the aisle have been discussing for quite some time now. This is not new to us. This is a discussion that we have been having as we not only are the chief legal officers of each of our particular states, but we also are tasked with protecting consumers in each of our states.
What are the issues that you are most concerned about, and what kind of action do you think needs to be taken?
Well, I think all of the issues that have been brought up concern me equally. I would tell you that each of them have a different take. Some of them have an antitrust avenue. Others have an unfair trade practices avenue as well. We were scheduled to discuss some of these issues with the FTC last week. That meeting has been postponed, and my understanding is they're rapidly trying to reschedule that particular meeting. You know, when it comes to the digital advertising space, that, I'll give you that as an example, could be both an antitrust and an unfair trade practice area.
So are you part of this inquiry that I mentioned where attorneys general are now looking into whether Google warrants a probe on antitrust and privacy issues?
Look, we have had a number of discussions with additional attorney generals, again, on both sides of the aisle. Each of us are looking at some of the same things and some additional issues where you mentioned content suppression as well. We are absolutely looking at big tech as a whole to determine what avenues may be appropriate in ensuring that our consumers are protected.
Google has, responded to this preliminary exploration saying privacy and security are built into all of our products, and we will continue to engage constructively with state attorneys general on policy issues. Republicans and conservatives have historically not wanted to regulate big business. How serious do you think conservatives are right now about regulating big tech, and what makes this situation different from historical situations?
Well, first of all, let's not confuse what Google said. Of course, Google, as well as everyone else out there in the industry that collects data on consumers, is concerned about the privacy of that particular data. That is not at all what the bigger picture of what attorney generals around the country are looking at. The question to Google is, what are you doing with the data that you're collecting? Does the consumer know what you're collecting on them? Are they getting the benefit? Is there a quid pro quo in that? And should consumers be getting more out of what you're collecting from them? on top of that is the data that Google is collecting from the consumer, is that proprietary to the consumer? That's one particular field. Then the next question is whether or not Google is manipulating the digital ad space. Are they controlling it in a way that basically would be unfair? You know, when you look at the big picture in the digital advertising space, the question I would pose is, would the FTC allow Chase or Goldman Sachs to own the NASDAQ? The answer to that would be absolutely not. They wouldn't allow them to own the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. Yet that's exactly what Google does in the advertising, in the digital advertising space.
So what do you think about privacy then in particular, and what role states should play in enforcing a federal privacy bill?
Well, again, the question when you talk about privacy, you know, that's a very broad subject. Are you talking about whether, you know, how individual companies protect the data that they already have? Or are you talking about being open and transparent with the consumer as to what you're collecting from them?
Now, when it comes to political bias, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, when he was Attorney General last year, called a meeting of you and your peers to talk about conservative bias on tech platforms. Do you believe some of these tech platforms are deliberately subverting conservative voices?
Well, I could tell you that some of the actions that I've seen on the big tech platform certainly raise that particular issue. The question, I have seen it, we have seen it time and time again when they have suppressed conservative content. We report it to them, we take action or ask them about it or inquiry, and of course it's always an apology from their standpoint. But again, at some point in time, when the mistake is made again and again and again, there becomes evidence that there is content suppression. I think that the concern that Senator Ted Cruz has raised is could be real, and that's what we're hoping to find out.
Speaking of Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Elizabeth Warren, both of them, Elizabeth Warren has advocated for the breakup of big tech. Ted Cruz has said, well, she has a good point. What you just said about not wanting Goldman or JP Morgan to own the NASDAQ sort of reminds me of that. I mean, what do you make of their arguments to break up big tech?
Look, it's certainly a possibility. I think it may be a road that may have to be traveled on. I think that attorney generals around the country are leaving all of the tools in the toolbox in an effort to try to cure some of the problems that we're seeing. You know, again, we're talking about a virtual marketplace that the average consumer has a hard time wrapping their heads around. But when you go to the digital ad space, look, I'll give you an example. I was trying to purchase a cover for a dog bed that I have. I had this large lap. He destroyed his dog bed. I didn't need the mattress. I just needed the cover. I went into the field and searched dog cover and the manufacturer. What I got on the first page was that the covers were all out of stock and I'd have to buy the entire bed. Knowing what goes on in a digital marketplace, I went to the second and third page and found the cover I was looking for. The question is Google purposely doing that? Are they driving consumers to more expensive avenues that they're not exactly looking for? Consumers have come to have an expectation that when you search for a particular product, that product, that what they're getting is quality and maybe quantity and service. And that's what we're trying to determine, whether or not the consumer's expectation is meeting what eventually comes out of the search.
All right, Louisiana Attorney General Jeff Landry, thank you so much. And for the explicit examples there, appreciate you stopping by. Coming up, Amazon may have withdrawn from New York, but it hasn't stopped expanding. We will discuss how the e-commerce giant is growing its Texas presence next. And Bloomberg Tech is live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology, and be sure to follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. Amazon is expanding in Texas. The e-commerce giant said Thursday it will hire an additional 800 engineers in Austin, Texas, in its first major U.S. office expansion since backing out of its New York City campus plans. Amazon dropped its expansion plans after running into fierce opposition from local politicians in New York. Joining us to discuss, Bloomberg's Matt Day. So tell us more about these new jobs.
So Amazon's very clear that these aren't jobs that were going to go to New York. They say they were planning this before they decided to pull out of their plans to go to Queens.
That was going to be my next question.
And so they, they're hiring about 800 people. It's going to be technology roles. They got about 1,000 people already there. Amazon's been expanding kind of at satellite offices around the country, and this is just the first one we've seen since they pulled out of New York.
But could this be a step towards another HQ or HQ 2.5 in Austin?
So far, they've tried to close the book on future HQ searches. They said after New York, they weren't going to reopen it. They weren't going to solicit new bids. And instead of putting a giant campus in Queens, they were going to kind of spread around those 25,000 jobs among their existing satellite R&D facilities around the U.S.
Do you think Amazon has learned its lesson from the fanfare around HQ2 or feels burned from the fanfare that accompanied that announcement?
That's a great question. I think candidly they tell you that they feel a little bit burned by it, but we haven't heard them kind of assess what went wrong there in a public way. They've been kind of typically quiet in their pullout and all that's come after.
So what does the expansion in Texas mean? I mean, obviously this is a big company. They've got employees in a lot of cities. So why Austin?
Austin's got a pretty rich tech heritage. Just a ton of stuff going on there. Apple's making a big move there, $1 billion campus that they're setting up. Amazon also has their biggest subsidiary, or most of the news anyway, in Whole Foods is based there. So there's a ton of reasons for them to be there and try to hire.
We're continuing to talk about government scrutiny of big tech. Do you have any sense that Amazon is concerned about the potentially impending regulatory issues, whether it's coming from Senator Elizabeth Warren or the president himself? And I know that gets a little complicated.
They haven't. They've tried at least to not comment on either Senator Warren's statements or, frankly, most times the president brings up Amazon. They've tried to stay kind of above it and haven't really commented a ton on antitrust stuff. One thing we do see that's pretty clear, though, is their expansion of their lobbying effort in D.C. They get a lot of issues before regulators, and certainly being able to speak to antitrust concerns a part of that expansion there.
Maybe Amazon's tried to stay above it, but Jeff Bezos has actually gone in pretty deep, and we haven't heard a lot on, the latest scandal and his sort of implication that maybe the White House could have been involved in the National Enquirer blackmailing him. Do you think that's the last we're going to hear? Like, is that story put to bed?
Yeah, I keep trying to call it and say this is the last thing, but there's just always something new and crazy on that one. So I wouldn't rule that out yet. But they've been pretty interested, Amazon and Bezos both, in trying to separate sort of that from the work in the company. And they've hewed to the same statement they said since that story broke, which is he remains engaged with the company.
All right, Bloomberg's Matt Day, thank you so much for stopping by. Coming up, Lyft may be the second largest ride-hailing service, but it'll be the first to hit the public markets. We're going to break down the company's numbers next. And also coming, another U.S. federal agency targeting Facebook, this time on allegations the social network's ad platform is discriminatory. That's coming up. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Lyft raised $2.2 billion in its initial public offering, pricing its shares at the top of an elevated range. Just got confirmation they did price the shares at $72 a piece, the high end of a boosted range, and it will likely be seen as a sort of bellwether for other Silicon Valley companies. The second largest U.S. ride-hailer priced 30.8 million shares, $72 a piece. Again, for more, I want to bring in Tim Sullivan, CEO of Oceanic Partners and a Lyft investor. So you must be pretty excited about this.
We are, certainly.
So why is $72 a share fair? Why a $22 billion valuation for a company that's losing a lot of money?
Sure. If you look at Lyft's top line growth, and that's really what the metric is that people they're judging that valuation against, it's essentially a 7x on their top line. So it's in line with a high growth company with a valuation of $25 billion, and a company still growing at almost 100% year over year. That's actually conservative. So I think Lyft has some room to grow from there.
So how much do the costs bother you?
I don't think the costs are that relevant for a company that's sacrificing costs for the growth that they're seeing. I think that Lyft has historically run an extremely capitally efficient business, and part of that is due to Uber's paving the way, so to speak, and Lyft being able to draft behind them and come in efficiently and execute per their vision. So I think they're going to continue to do that, and I think if they can crack the insurance nut and a few other things, you'll see profits coming sooner than anticipated.
What about the marketing and the customer acquisition nut? Because, I've been on the receiving end of deep discounts from both Lyft and Uber, especially in the last couple of months. It seems almost every other week they're offering like 30% off.
I think heading into IPO season, both companies are spending a lot of money on marketing, trying to get their ridership up and drivers and everything else. So I don't know that that's a line item that's going to be consistent and sustained. I think those discounts are going to start to wane a bit as we move forward.
Now, there's the story that Lyft is selling, which is that it's going to replace car ownership for millennials. On the other hand, there's we are going to replace drivers with self-driving technology. And in a way, that just seems at odds with the other idea that they're giving jobs to all of these people who can now work flexibly as a result. How do you square that?
Well, I think Lyft's mission is really more along the lines of transport as a service, as opposed to specifically ride-hailing or ride-sharing. I also think that the autonomous car is further away than people thought. I think a year ago, people thought, oh, in 6 months, San Francisco is going to have autonomous cars everywhere, and that didn't happen. There's a lot of technological roadblocks and hurdles that still need to be gotten over for it to be something that's considered reliable and safe and going to be adopted on a large scale. So it's not right around the corner.
Yeah, so how far away is it? Because you're saying exactly the opposite of what another Uber investor told me earlier this week, saying actually, self-driving is closer than we think. He said 3 to 5 years.
Well, 3 to 5 years is not right around the corner, in my opinion. I think 3 to 5 years is a reasonable assumption, but it could certainly be more like 5 to 7. And I think, given that, a lot of things are going to change in the meantime.
Like what?
I think, as you mentioned, car ownership is declining with millennials, and who knows what's going to happen with the next generation. I think the service industry and all of its iterations, ride sharing and sharing services in the sharing economy, I should say, in general, are changing our environment, our world in ways that we hadn't even considered 2 years ago.
So what are you going to be watching for tomorrow?
I am obviously going to be watching what everybody is. I'm going to be looking for a nice pop on the open. I saw one of the finance shows this morning say it was going to come out with the first trade at 100. I'd be thrilled if that was the case, but I'm excited. I'm watch for high volume, I think, like everybody.
All right, speaking of volume, Lyft pricing 32.5 million shares at $72 a piece, not 30.8 million, as we said earlier. But either way, this is still giving the company a $22 billion valuation. And do you think, Tim, that, among other tech unicorns, that's a fair valuation of the company?
I think you just have to go back to the fundamentals of Lyft and look at their revenues and look at their growth and look at their expenses and model it out against industry comps. And if you do, you're going to find that for Lyft specifically, that is a fair valuation. If you apply it to other companies, you're going to come out with a different result because they do have different fundamentals.
Do you invest in public companies?
No.
So you wouldn't be buying more shares?
That's not our model. No, we're specifically private company focused, and we do hold through the IPO and then some, but we're not public market investors per se.
So what's the next wave? You've got Silicon Valley has a lot of companies going public this year. Now you have to find new horses to bet on.
There's plenty of new horses to bet on, and we're looking at new opportunities on literally a daily basis.
Like what?
One of the ones that we're excited about right now is a company called SyncThink. They're in the concussion protocol space, and they've been widely adopted in the NCAA and other spaces. They're They're changing the game as far as head injuries go, and we're pretty excited about the prospects of that company.
All right, Tim Sullivan of Oceanic Partners, appreciate you having you with us. I know you'll be watching very closely tomorrow. And do not miss our interview with Lyft's co-founders, John Zimmer and Logan Green, 9:45 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. I will be speaking with them in person right here on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. Coming up, Facebook under fire for its ad targeting practices. We have all the details next. This is Bloomberg. As we mentioned earlier, Facebook is already the target of the Federal Trade Commission for privacy violations. And on Thursday, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development said it is charging the social network with violating the Fair Housing Act, allegedly. HUD says that Facebook did so by restricting who can view housing-related ads on the basis of things like race and religion. Here's what Housing Secretary Ben Carson said in a statement. Facebook is discriminating against people based on who they are, where they live. Using a computer to limit a person's housing choices can be just as discriminatory as slamming a door in someone's face. We should also note that HUD has reached out to Twitter and Google for more information about their ad targeting practices. To discuss, we've got Bloomberg's Naomi Nix, who covers corporate influence in Washington, and here in the studio, Bloomberg Tech's Selena Wang. So, Selena, this is a pretty damning lawsuit, and Facebook has reacted quite strongly to it, saying that they're very disappointed.
It's definitely caught Facebook off guard. Just last week, they actually settled several lawsuits with civil rights groups like the ACLU, the Fair Housing Alliance, saying that they were going to overhaul their ad platform so that advertisers of housing or employment-related ads would not be able to do this sort of micro-targeting on the basis of areas like gender and sex. Now, HUD is arguing that that doesn't go far enough, and they're charging that Facebook still allows these discriminatory ads to exist. They even allege that there was the ability for advertisers to target based on where they lived by drawing a red line around these areas. Also alleging that Facebook uses online data as well as offline data to able to figure out with machine learning what these characteristics of these people are based on these protected groups, like on the basis of race, gender, sex, even if they're not explicitly allowed to target those groups.
Now, Facebook's statement, we're surprised by HUD's decision as we've been working with them to address their concerns and have taken significant steps to prevent ads discrimination. Last year, we eliminated thousands of targeting options that could potentially be misused. We're disappointed by today's developments, but we'll continue working with civil rights experts on these issues. By the way, Naomi, Facebook a couple of weeks ago actually changed a bunch of their ad targeting practices because of complaints around these issues. They say they worked with civil rights groups to make those changes, which is part of the reason Facebook seems to be so caught off guard. Why is the HUD taking this action?
Well, I think it's just, another symptom of Washington regulators continuing to ask questions about the social media companies' targeted advertising policies. House Democrats, now that they've taken control of the House, have made it clear that they are intending to seek more answers to questions about whether targeted advertising on Facebook and other social media companies, is discriminating against minority communities. And so I think it's clear that Washington, as the HUD secretary made it clear in this move, but Washington in general is putting the heat on Facebook around this issue.
When you look a little bit more closely, Selena, at the categories that advertisers were allowed to tick or not tick, parents, non-American, non-Christian, interested in accessibility and Hispanic culture. It's interesting thinking about sort of what was going into these product decisions, ad product decisions by Facebook, and why they thought this was a good idea.
And it's also interesting because these policies are only as good as their enforcements, and Facebook isn't required to hand over their algorithms. So clearly there was some sort of data mechanism going on that told them these are interesting targeted groups that would actually be very beneficial to advertisers and get them more clicks. So clearly there's a reason why they picked those groups. But if anybody goes online,
you can also exclude those groups by not targeting.
And if you go online to Facebook right now, anybody can try and make an ad. You'll see that there are dozens and dozens of different behavioral, educational, income categories that anybody can pick. And so the trust is being put upon Facebook that if you are doing a housing, credit, or employment-related ad, that their algorithms and humans are going to be able to catch that. But it's unclear whether or not it's going to be as effective as they say it will be.
All right. The government has also reached out to Google and Twitter about their ad targeting practices. We've got a statement from Google saying, we've had policies in place for many years that prohibit targeting ads on the basis of sensitive categories like race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, disability status, negative financial standing, etc. Our policies are designed to protect users and ensure advertisers are using our platforms in a responsible manner. Naomi, is there any indication that Google's targeting practices are vastly different from Facebook, or how the government may proceed in these other two cases?
Well, I think it's clear that, Google says it's not discriminating in the same way. But it's clear that, Google hasn't also been as open with its algorithms and the behind-the-scenes mechanism it uses to determine its advertising. And more access to that kind of information has been a top concern here in Washington. And so I think it remains to be seen whether there are ways that Google isn't certifying internally that those advertisements are compliant with housing discrimination law.
All right. Something, of course, we're going to continue to follow and watch to see how this unfolds. With the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Bloomberg's Selena Wang and Naomi Nix, thank you both. Still ahead, Google is facing growing backlash over a conversion therapy app in its Play Store. Why the search giant has yet to remove it? Next. This is Bloomberg. The popular gay dating app Grindr is now being viewed as a national security concern. According to a report from Reuters, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States has told the Chinese gaming company Beijing Kunlun to sell the app. The government agency expressed concerns that Beijing could use personal information from the app to blackmail American officials. Joining us to discuss Asia Society Senior Fellow Isaac Stonefish. Isaac, this is a fascinating story, and Beijing Kunlun is already in the process of trying to sell this company. I had no idea that the U.S. government could order China to sell a company.
They're certainly trying. We don't quite know yet if Beijing Kunlun Media is going to try and sell Grindr, which they shouldn't have too much of a problem to do so. It's a fabulously successful app. We've just seen some anonymous reporting about it, but it really does point to a lot of really fascinating national security implications of where the U.S.-China relationship is right now.
So talk to us about what the national security implications are.
So Grindr is similar to the tech giant Huawei in that both of them are non-state-owned companies. Grindr is listed, Beijing Kunlun is listed, Huawei is privately owned. But because of the relationship between individuals and businesses and the ruling Communist Party, American security officials can't trust that the founder of Beijing Kunlun, a guy named Zhou Yahui, wouldn't give the data, the photos, to the Communist Party if the party so desired.
Right, so we're talking about very personal, potentially very explicit photos, data about users of this app. Kunlun had planning to list Grindr publicly, but now at least Reuters is reporting they're shifting to possibly selling it outright, and Grindr is actually soliciting interest already from U.S. investment firms. I mean, how do you expect this to play out?
I think Grindr, I think one of the stories that said that they're trying to sell it for double what they paid for it, which was roughly, I think, 250 million. So I think it'll work out fine for Beijing Kunlun Media, but it really does point to where we are in the relationship today. And I think what we have to remember when we think about Grindr is that China is far more advanced in facial recognition software and big data, and you don't have to be that creative to think about what a potentially hostile foreign power could do with facial recognition and Grindr.
You often see acquisitions stopped or certainly scrutinized, but you don't very often see acquisitions undone. How does this fit into the broader context of what's happening with Huawei, with the U.S.-China trade war that is ongoing?
I think what the U.S. government is trying to communicate both to Chinese firms and to American firms is that they're going to place their view of national security first. And I think, you know, it's funny because it's a non-traditional company for this to happen to, but I do think this could potentially chill other Chinese investors or other American investors in working together.
We've seen President Trump sort of vacillate in his statements on the latest negotiations with China, most recently seeming to indicate that he wouldn't want to lift the tariffs. How is this being received in China most recently, and what is the Chinese government telling its people?
There was frustration after the summit that Trump had with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, where Trump walked away because he didn't get the deal that he wanted. And I think some Chinese officials have interpreted this as a sign that if Chinese Chairman Xi Jinping goes and meets with Trump, whether it's in the States or in China, and they sit down and do negotiations, Trump might just walk away, which would be a very, very frustrating thing for the Chinese leader. So I think one of the things Beijing is communicating to its own people about this is that a deal is not necessary for what they're trying to do. I think one of the worries that Chinese leaders have about the trade war is it's hitting on consumer confidence, and not necessarily in ways that we can really find numbers with, but more in the sense of Xi Jinping is portrayed as someone who can do no wrong, and he has not been able to have a steady and successful conclusion to this, and it's certainly hurt his confidence domestically.
Meantime, the CEO of Google met with the top-ranking military officer in the United States, met with the president. They talked about their concerns about Google's potential work in China. Google continues to say that they're not planning to launch a search engine in China. They do have an AI office there that is seemingly giving them some headaches. But do you think that the era of U.S. companies freely trying to expand in China is over as a result of this increased government scrutiny?
I hope the era of them freely expanding is over. I hope we come to an era where they try to smartly expand in China. It would be so useful to Chinese students, intellectuals, professors, if they could use Google in Chinese. It's a much better product than Baidu. Unfortunately, the ruling Communist Party in China, will not allow Google to come in as is. So it's good for the Chinese people. It's bad for Google to go into China, and I think we're trying to find out what the new normal is, and I think it's really an open question right now.
All right, Asia Society Senior Fellow Isaac Stone-Fish, thanks so much for coming on and breaking down some of these complex issues. Appreciate it. Well, Google has lost an endorsement from the Human Rights Campaign, the largest gay rights group in the United States. The advocacy group is withholding Google's perfect score on its annual Corporate Equality Index until the search giant removes an app tied to conversion therapy practices. It said, "We've been urging Google to remove this app because it is life-threatening to LGBTQ youth and also clearly violates the company's own standards." Google declined to comment. Joining us to discuss, Bloomberg's Alistair Barr. Tell us a little bit more about what's happening here.
This is a classic case of Google's App Store and whether they police it carefully enough and whether they want to get dragged into decisions on these types of issues. So this app has been on the Play Store for a while, and obviously this organization, human rights organization, does not like it, and it allegedly pushes conversion therapy, which has obviously been debunked in a lot of circles.
We've seen a lot of employee activism at Google. Is something like this likely to push their buttons?
Well, I would say Google's main I don't know whether vulnerability is the right word, but it's completely obsessed with hiring and retaining the best talented engineers, and it will do basically anything within its powers legally to retain and hire people. So and a lot of people who are in this field and want to work in diverse and supportive workplaces, and a rating from this human rights campaign organization would be helpful for that. So Google is in a very tricky place in that a lot of its employees really care about these issues, and if it's not going to do anything, they're going to be angry, and Google might struggle to hire more people.
Is this in the Apple App Store too?
So the Human Rights Campaign says that it was in the Apple App Store, but it is no longer. Apple took it down, and this is a classic case. Apple is much more comfortable with pulling things from the app for specific reasons. Google is very much supportive of free speech for its search engine and its app store. So it gets very tricky for Google in these situations.
Google's also recently been criticized for failing to remove an app called Absher, which was created by the Saudi government, which allows men to track women.
Exactly.
This was also in the Apple App Store. I don't know if it's still, is it still in both app stores?
Yeah. Well, I think it was certainly in Google's App Store until very recently, and it's the same type of situation where Google is really loath to be taking sides on these types of issues, and it loves to have everything on the web and everything in the App Store, and not to be taking sides. But it's so big and influential now; it's being pushed to make these types of decisions.
Right.
More.
Increasingly being held responsible for the content that it promotes and it is on its platforms. Okay, Alistair Barr, thank you so much. I know you'll continue to follow that one for us. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. A programming note, Bloomberg's Tom McKenzie has an exclusive interview with Huawei's rotating chair that'll air later on Friday. And of course, we're live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology. Follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. We will be covering Lyft's public offering tomorrow. I'll be sitting down with Lyft's co-founders, John Zimmer and Logan Green, as the company gets out of the gate. This is Bloomberg.